the public enemy that is the function of those who support the war on David to engage in the subversion of national security in opposition by acts of sedition for the purposes of committing treason, thus restraining an officer according to their intention who would otherwise engage in the functions arranged necessary to the government, and in the obstruction of the officer in his official proceedings or duties, materially engage in crimes sabotaging the function of the government. And to this end, their belief or intention to do that is the purpose for their manufacturing of the war on David, presuming David to be arrested on the basis of being the patriarchy, would presume the position of him becoming the six-star intelligence oversight, congressional oversight general, maintaining the position of that office to be restrained in its official duties, and thus the function of David from infancy, having sustained himself according to the legend of David companies supporting the function, would force them in that arrangement to hire David specifically, who would then subcontract his faculties as subordinate functions in the legend of David company and other subordinate functions derivative in connection to the Legend of David non-profit companies. And to this end, that mechanism maintains the full support structure and faculties essential to any of David's actions, and without does not have sober control of faculties, as without the possession of those functions does not possess those functions, and therefore may not have sober control over those functions, and therefore is blocked from any government engagement which requires sober control of faculties in order to engage in any response, which in this situation is restrained under that sedition in order to prevent it, and in that purpose has intended for those actions. To this end, that materially requires them to sue Congress for David's right to pursue, as they, having compromised it for insurrection, which has legally disbanded them from being legally Congress, but rather has become an insurgency of the Soviet Union for insurrection as an anti-Soviet Congress. The Soviets' Congress is not the Americans' Congress. Note the difference, and to this extent, the mechanism of the war in order to collapse the United States government in systematic collapsing of essential functions of the government as they dismantle it for the purposes derived by the Soviet Union and its plots, which it's seeded against the United States and the West abroad, and thus the function of the virus engaging in proximity to the similar virus hyperaccelerates the function, and in the function of that virus creating a rash materializes the flaring up by the proximity of the two viruses in the body, showing the signal or the general damage, which in that example of the body would be a rash, or in the example of the government, the damage is against the interest of those societies collaborating as a unit called the West, which has culminated in the voter fraud, which has systematically restrained David's national news and other fundamental functions in that action as a subordinate function, as they are a part of his faculties, and therefore without his faculties, the restrained parties can receive the divvying out of their criminal intentions to engage in all of the injuries desired. And thus the mechanism of the voter fraud systematically replaces the president, the Congress, and all other elected leaders materially to be replaced by the Soviet Union's anti-government, anti-Congress, anti-president, and so on, which, being derivative by the voter fraud, is in service of the Soviet Union, is not American elected leaders, and may not legally be certified to the function, and the action of the criminal intention of that certification is a disqualifier of all parties aiding and abetting, before the fact, during the fact, and after the fact, as a single unit monster materially engaging in the peak of the action as a concentration spell is the maintaining of it as the peak, maintains the action of its consistent concentration to the mechanism of those criminal damages in hope and derivative of the intention of the full damages cited in the criminal intent page from the lawdictionary.org/criminal-intent/ website, which then maintains the full example, which should be expressly defined in any expression, as the restraining of David's faculties is included the preventing or blocking him from the pursuit of the remedy, includes blocking him from access to any lawyer that would agree to contract with him without the obstruction, and thus the action of the obstructions and the complications generating the blocking lawyer has blocked David Boles from the action of having access to his lawyers, which would be able to be recreated from that function upon their ability to sue Congress for David's right to pursue, removing the coercion, which is the returning of the faculties, allowing the faculties to engage in that action, which would then systematically discover from the investigation derivative of the existence of those faculties to engage in the full expression in the reports to Congress and the demands labeled the remedy, and thus Congress, having been compelled by the legal opinion by the SCOTUS, stating that the Americans have the right to pursue the remedy, may not be restrained or prohibited from that action, and therefore the restoration essential to the function of the pursuit must be allowed, as otherwise they would be engaging in the common sense erectionist function of a war of attrition for the purpose of exhaustion, and therefore the collapsing of contracts and access from the faculties to work and engage in profitable exchanges for the pursuit of their own happiness and to their own ends, materially engaging in those rights in order to find a place in society and find services in order to express the means of the justification of their place in society, having been blocked, is strictly prohibited as the criminal action of blocking David from the pursuit of the remedy, as a network or singular crime in a network, which is derivative of the mousetrap. And thus the action expressly defining the mousetrap includes the theory of the creation of the world, which creates all of the materials, which then puts them together, which then zaps life into them, creating the ecosystem as a whole system that relies on each other, as any part of the mousetrap that is removed destroys the thing, is no longer identifying as a mousetrap. Materializing that function further, the game then becomes create a better mousetrap. To the extent of the purpose of life of creating the better mousetrap materializes the full development of the expression, the pursuit of happiness. As life requires life, and thus the function of life requiring life creates greater and greater systems of life, and therefore the system of the creation of greater life or improved conditions, or the definitional human decency derivative by status, which then maintains the ability to sustain and recreate life, is the function of pursuing the happiness of finding their own way in the jigsaw puzzle that is society. Now, the function of their service to Satan for the Soviet Union materializes their opposition, as the function expresses the competition between Druids in the representative theocracy of their society, which then maintains the control of each of the primary systems in competition with each other, like kingdoms fighting over each other's functions, and thus the action of each season being derivative is the function of maintaining the region throughout the seasons, instead of the function of being an enemy. The seasons are collaborators, and then the function of the Oak King, according to the religion, is not an enemy to the Holly King, or to the Fall King, or to the Spring King, as holly brings flowers, brings summer, brings pumpkin lattes. To this end, the mechanism of the primary seasons and the services specifically attached as specialties associated with them are collaborations to the same region, and thus are the existence inside of that region, which is sustained by those who sustain the existence of that territory in a permanent state, as opposed to those who migrate through it, who otherwise might be considered foreign or alien, and thus the action defines alien as those who are migrating through, to the extent that that be those who are in different counties, states, countries, or parts of the universe, such as other planets, or whether or not they live in a ship, or whether or not they live in hyperdimensional space, from psychedelic experiences transmuting time and space as the function of light is traveling at the exponential speed that it is generated from the sun, that the experience of it having existed is at the speed of light, which, as we all know, the faster one travels, the slower time is experienced, and thus the mechanism of time experience ends at the speed of light, and therefore the creation of the sun creates the light, which experiences itself in its entirety when it lands on the object that it is absorbed into, therefore expressing the whole of its existence, which would then materialize the function of extra light travel speed, which would then expressly define the theory concerning the psychedelic experience under the theory that the machine elves are living entities and not imaginations of the mind, but real things, such as bacteria inside of the gut, which already materially exist outside of time and space and in a different dimensional function, traversing hyper quantity and hyperspace, throw out the light years of separation, that they may express the copy of themselves, imbuing their identity, the full expression of itself that only experiences itself when it lands upon the object absorbing it. And thus the experiencer of the psychedelic experience receives them existing for the first time in their timeless experience of their permanent identity. Or some other thing that I haven't considered. Who knows? Reality is stranger than fiction. To this end, the mechanism of the competing nation at war with each other engages in the function of the druids at the higher level as D&D druids, which engage in the function of wild shape, which then maintain the increasing of the CR ability, and thus the ability for them to have progressed through that system systematically hyper-imbues into themselves the ability to create higher and higher CRs on the basis of their promotion according to that structure, materializing better and better creatures in order to transform into, such as the function of the high priestess, which would culminate at the highest level of the most powerful creatures, such as the generation of the dragons in question, which would then be expressly proven through the Final Fantasy XV game, which has the high priest being able to transform into these megalithic giant creatures, which would express the pinnacle of their priesthood in their theocracy, challenging all other competitors to their competitors' theocracy as they have their epic battles through the devotion to mankind's struggle sessions with each other, as it is natural and its tendency for humankind to fight and make war, to struggle and to fail and to rise again. This then settles the concept of the Oak King being an enemy of the Holly King, which they imbue the title in their War on David to David Boles as the Holly King, as the mechanism of the thing that preserves this priesthood throughout that system and this society throughout that system, which then maintains the mechanism of the global position of David's constitutional kingdom that they theorized and are holding against him according to their criminal intention, materializing the function of that brokerage nation, which would then sustain as the peace child, resolving the conflicts as the god of war, which would then resolve the conflicts and de-escalate them into the various settlements according to this theory. They posture that that system being stronger than theirs is not them being in charge, and therefore they retaliate in their restraints for the abuses for the purposes of those crimes. To these purposes and intentions, they materialize all of their horrific damages against the world, which suffers the absence of the preserver throughout starvation seasons, and thus the action of each season having its own specialty, such as sports in the summer or uh, pumpkin spice in the fall or flowers in the springtime, maintains the function of each season bringing forth the other season. And to the end of the winter, the maintaining of starvation creates grumpiness in the function of starvation and retaliation and hatred and malice, or the function of the preservation of having properly saved everything in order to be able to maintain and stabilize the society or village in question, which then maintains the function of celebrations throughout the starvation season in order to sustain themselves, that they might survive till Flower King. And to the end that the system maintains itself is based upon the generosities and divisions of those presents, which qualifies the specialty in question, which systematically, as a competing druid, would view all of those things in order to exhaust the strengths specifically derivative of the thing, and therefore Santa must be turned into Krampus, Tigger must be turned into Grumpy from the Care Bears. In order to maintain these systematic positions, the crime is the confession, as the purpose of the crime and its material benefits expresses the purpose of the bank robbery in question, and thus the action of it as a bank robbery as its own mousetrap maintains the position of each criminal having their own specialty, which includes the function of the getaway car in order for them to get away, and the specialty of keeping the secret after, as their service has permanently imbued their entire identity to the armed robbery, which escaping it maintains the consistent concentration, as if it is quote unquote slipped that they'd done the robbery, then they would be punished for it, and all of their earnings would be divided, and they would be fined accordingly and forced to compensate XYZ to the ends of their victims. And to this end, the material facilitation of that adversary of Frazovulu engaging in these subversions for the collapse of that priesthood makes the position that if they kill the Santa in question, if they kill the Holly King, then they'll create Krampus. But the existence of Krampus or the existence of the Antichrist or any of the other crimes that they've imbued onto themselves, such as the ritual abuses and concentrations, is specifically essential to create the one world government in Revelation for the purpose of manufacturing the Antichrist, that they may rise from the theft of the other things in order to engage in their sacrifices to the earth, in order to create that Antichrist and all of the damages specifically associated with it, as the bank robbery in question creates all of the damages and robberies which are owed to their victims, as the culmination of the consequences of all of their crimes are the liabilities of those crimes, as an intention for it to exist directly and through no gross negligence, as an absence of the things that they've removed creates compounding damages which are systematically intended to exist. To this ends the material service of running away from the thing that they're trying to get away from by running into it is the trap by Frazo Bulu, who is systematically tricking them into committing suicide, or a system of being conformed in the progressing throughout the stages or degrees of the various diversified cults specifically designed for the destruction. To this end, the material position has them seek to kill the Holly King in order to stop Krampus, but the existence of killing the Santa puts them on the naughty list, creates the Krampus. The action of killing the man creates the devil, and to this end, in order to avoid the thing, they've run straight into it, similar to the function of one of the early Final Fantasies, where the soldiers of light travel through time and space in order to fight Garland, who they would have in that situation created a scrying system which creates the outcome of the apocalypse, where they systematically turn Garland into the Antichrist, which is the fault that they chose to do in the system of the Wizards of Light, being able to create the scrying system in order to create them so that they, having hyper-trained in the time capsule, materialize their ability to fight Garland, defeating the imaginary, falsely accused Antichrist Garland in order to engage in that function as they increase in those systematic subversions and crimes through that time capsule, maintain the creation of the opposition for that Garland, materializing the Krampus in question, which is entirely their fault. Which, of course, proves the exact opposite of them being the heroes, and thus the action of them being heroes is being disqualified. They are subject as lawful good to be at the service of Frazobolo in his trap and his systematic ritual sacrifices, where they will be systematically destroyed and find out in the afterlife that they would be given as the illusion is recreated specifically for them, which is slowly dissolved, leading to them being fully consumed by Frazobolo, who has thoroughly deceived them and turned them into a tasty morsel or a savory snack, such as, but is not limited to, Hansel and Gretel's witch, which created the candy cottage and was fattening them all up, and thus their subjugation to become that tasty morsel was their compliance to all of the actions in the illusion from the scrying, which created the ability for them to run into the trap. In order to avoid it, they became ensnared by it, as is specifically derived by their quote-unquote criminal intent. As is expressly noted, again, it bears repeating, includes gross negligence, which is derived by the absence of their actions creating the consequences, as the actions of them taking over a system, such as, but not limited to, in farming, the sustaining of a monoculture crop materially deprives the land and is not reproducible, as they've gone into a land that is rich and flourishing, derived by its diversity, which then maintains itself in perpetuity, dividing all of the nutrients of the soil, which is then stripped for the monocrop, which then engages in the full stripping of the land of all of its value, which, as long as it does not get replaced by them who stripped it, would become fully barren, as it is a manufactured, man-made desert because of their criminal intention. Which bears repeating, as that, in fact, was the thing that created the apocalyptic vision in the first place, was their creation of the monoculture without properly replacing the system, as nature had been removed in order to create the desert. And the desert has the white sands, and the white sands are actively moldable by Frazobolo's staff, which creates his sand castle, his realm without a ruler, an army, or even a people, a variable kingdom of dust.